Hi, my name is Steve Lozier. I'm an education specialist in the Metropolitan School District of Wayne Township, and I'm focused on helping teachers plan and implement project-based learning in our schools. This module is one of many designed to help teachers better understand project-based learning and design and develop PBL units to engage and challenge their students. This presentation is available to you by following the link in the My Big Campus bundle, as well as the Google folder associated with it. And I'd suggest that you open that presentation in another tab, as you may want to pause this video and go explore a resource or look at something further in the presentation. And please note, if you are new to PBL and building your knowledge, this video would be considered the first in the sequence. So, inviting you into the conversation. So there's numerous PBL definitions out there, and something that's beneficial is to think about how those PBL definitions align with your teaching identity or your teaching philosophy. So a useful exercise that I've found is to read these definitions and then note words or phrases that either repeat or resonate with you. Using the next two slides, jot down or copy and paste these noted words or phrases to construct your own definition and understanding of project-based learning. And there's a document in the bundle or the Google folder titled Wayne Defining PBL Thinking Tool to assist you if you need that help. And please note that there's some definitions use the term project and others use the term problem. That's explored further in a different module titled PBL and the Degrees of Inquiry, but for the sake of this activity, just look for those keywords or phrases. So I'll just leave these slides in here for a couple seconds. Feel free to pause the presentation. This one. And then these are examples of teachers who have done this activity in professional development, just to give you an idea of what they've kind of synthesized. So then it's beneficial to compare your definition with what Wayne's come to define PBL as. So Wayne Township defines project-based learning as an educational culture and curricular approach in which students and educators engage in a process of inquiry that makes learning relevant by placing content in an authentic context. It requires active learning, problem-solving, critical thinking, collaboration, and constant reflection. And that definition has been created by teacher leadership throughout the district. We've also decided that project-based learning in Wayne Township consists of these following elements. So relevant content balanced with 21st century skills, a driving question or a challenge, an entry event or need to know that creates relevance, an inquiry process that demands innovation, a public presentation of a product, a partnership, with an expert or a stakeholder, also known as kind of an authentic audience, student voice and choice, formative assessment centered on feedback and revision, embedded best practices, so those instructional strategies and practices we know work, and focus on rigor. And we're going to go through those into more depth now. So the following slides go through each of those elements. So significant content and 21st century skills. These are those standards, concepts, and skills that make up the unit. So then, as this image implies, PBL often causes educators and students to shift or refocus to look at how well students can apply and use learning or knowledge in multiple relevant, authentic contexts. And accordingly, learning goals and performance assessments or indicators must also shift to reflect that. Content knowledge is only valuable relative to how it can be used or leveraged by the learner, and there's a greater emphasis on student skills with that content knowledge. In terms of the lesson design language, this is what we call transfer. So this may be a good time to point out that PBL was born in medical skill out of concern for graduating doctors that had all of the knowledge but struggled to use it or implement it effectively or appropriately. Think of it like a doctor that can effectively diagnose a condition but struggles to isolate symptoms that are from the condition and others that may be the result of a patient's medical history or lifestyle. Struggles to communicate effectively with that patient both in terms of gleaning information from the patient through questions and communicating diagnosis and treatment in a way the patient can understand and implement, all while presenting a good bedside manner. So that points out some of the skills that PBL really tried to go about in terms of the medical field. Another way to think about this is a shift from covering standards to uncovering, and I borrow that idea from Tony Vincent. He says that we need to shift instruction from teachers covering standards to students uncovering those standards, so the application and use of content standards and knowledge. Sorry. So think of it like you're supercharging your content knowledge and skills with those 21st century skills. A unit framed in relevance is also a unit steeped in rigor. And now you may be thinking, wait, so I have to teach more. And in a way, yes, but PBL instruction is also student-centered, where learning is done with students and not to them. And the 21st century skills add rigor and relevance in a way that engages students authentically, not passively. So consequently, teachers can now leverage that engagement to often challenge students at a much higher level of relevant, authentic, real-world expectation. And the higher the level of the engagement and the focus of the application and use of knowledge to collaboratively create a product and communicate via a presentation about both the product and the learning processes causes a much higher degree of transfer beyond just a unit or a test, but to the future courses, to educational experiences, to experiences in personal and professional life. So a driving question or challenge is a term used by various PBL organizations, including BIE, and the obvious analogy is that students use the question to drive the unit toward their end destination. It guides the work. It's similar to the big ideas and essential questions purported by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTee in their work on understanding by design, and this is also known as beginning with the end in mind or backwards design, planning, mapping. The driving question or challenge serves as a focus of the unit, but in PBL, rather than this focus being leveraged largely for planning purposes by the teacher, as it does in understanding by design, the question frames the inquiry and engages students in the inquiry process, giving them ownership of the content and learning. The driving question or challenge activates the inquiry or engages students and then serves as a constant question that guides and evaluates student progress toward the learning targets. In other words, what we know works in the planning of curriculum becomes valuable in the teaching of those units to bring students into the learning process and conversation. That's the taught curriculum, as well as valuable in the assessment of the learned curriculum by both teachers and students, as well as relevant stakeholders. The need to know list is an essential tool of PBL inquiry. It constantly answers what is often students' most burning question of instruction and assessment and education: why do I need to know this? The list can take on many forms, from a simple T-chart to a digital space. It can be a list used by an entire class or even course, or used by a group, or even be an individual list. Students first engage with the need-to-know space when the unit is launched, and initially this is a space for students to grapple with the driving question or challenge, align themselves and their background knowledge with the learning experience or task, and eventually organize those thoughts into a plan of action to pursue an answer or provide a solution. The key is that this driver of inquiry is returned to and referred to often for a few reasons. One, by assessing what is known and still needs to be learned, students focus and refocus on the task, not losing sight of the end goal and transferring knowledge, understanding, and skills in the process. Two, referencing the list reminds students of their progress in both an affirming way, where they feel a sense of accomplishment towards the goal, which buffers the feeling of being overwhelmed with such a challenging, rigorous task, and in a way that places a greater emphasis on the learning process rather than the end product and the student growth the learning process facilitates. In a PBL context, inquiry is deep, engaged, active thinking where questions often lead to more questions rather than answers. And the discomfort students and teachers can feel from focusing more on the learning process and the focus on critical thinking is what makes PBL such a powerful learning experience, as the inquiry reshapes knowledge and constructs the brain itself. Risk-taking and the possibility of failure is necessary for success and growth. Unfortunately, our society and consequently educational system shies away from this essential disequilibrium or discomfort or cognitive dissonance. Innovation is the use of content and knowledge to create new knowledge, and in the case of PBL, demonstrate that growth with a new idea or product that is presented to other stakeholders. Over the course of a PBL unit, the initial engagement of inquiry for students must lead them to and sustain their energy in such a way that they are learning, that the learning and knowledge is owned by the learner, pushing students to synthesize learning of content and concepts and then think in terms of possibility and probability to create something original and new not only ensures rigor, it supportively helps students practice the kind of thinking that will be necessary for them to be lifelong reflective learners wherever their future leads. So nearly all learning in a PBL unit serves the purpose of meeting the expectations that students will create a solution or product with their learning and present it to someone or some organization that has a stake in the problem or challenge. As was explored in the previous need to know element, students transfer content, knowledge, and skills toward the highest levels of synthesis as they create a product and present it. Regarding partnerships, we have seen an evolution of this PBL element over the years, especially here in Wayne Township. BIE and other PBL organizations use the term authentic audience to often describe a person, group, or an organization that is a stakeholder in the problem or challenge students are grappling with. As the word audience implies, traditionally these stakeholders served as summative evaluators that attended to the presentation at the end of a PBL unit and provided feedback to students on their product, performance, and learning. However, through implementation, we've learned that having a partnership or authentic audience causes students to engage with and care about the problem or challenge at a much higher level. This increases the relevance, which in turn increases the rigor, causing students to often shock teachers and stakeholders with what they are capable of. We have also gravitated toward the term and idea of partnerships because experts can often be valuable during the unit when they can directly address a student need to know when they need to know it, or come in to work with students and give them a jolt or a shot in the arm to re-engage them if motivation is decreased. A good way to think about partnerships and authentic audiences is on a continuum, with a range starting with presenting to classmates, teachers, and school-based stakeholders, up to professionals that deal with the problem and challenge, legislators, community-based decision makers, and stakeholders that could actually cause change. Student voice and choice. So this element is definitely one of the most powerful, but can also challenge the traditional teacher-student dynamic and power involved, which can be an adjustment for both teachers and students. It should most likely involve open communication with parents and administrators. In order to engage students and give them ownership of their learning, a PBL unit invites students into learning conversation where they can critically think about and communicate how to best tackle the task. Student voice and choice can be evident in an infinite number of ways. Teachers must consider their own teaching style and their level of comfort in handing power to students. For some teachers, it is natural, and for others, it's a challenge. Just as some students thrive with choice and others struggle. Teachers' discretion and judgment is essential here. Simply put, student voice and choice is the teacher asking instead of telling students, how should we do this, and considering their ideas and input in order to progress through learning. We commonly see evidence of this element leveraged through the use of groups in order to teach and develop collaboration. Groups will create a plan of action to tackle the problem or meet the challenge, assign roles and responsibility, manage their work in terms of time. However, the best PBL teachers are facilitators with these groups, guiding and pushing their thinking and intervening if or when conflict arises, and embracing these opportunities as teachable moments. Sometimes it's beneficial to remember how teachers can differentiate instruction when thinking about how much student voice and choice to allow students. Remember, you can differentiate content, process, product, and learning environment as long as you are not shifting the learning target or rigor. When I ask teachers to think about differentiating content, I ask them to consider what subject matter or topics would most engage students in order for them to develop a specific skill. The structure of PBL can naturally differentiate the process, as there is no predetermined or set path to student learning. The need to knows naturally have students starting at different points in the journey, and the choice involved allows students to chart their own path with the teacher as the guide. In terms of product differentiation, I often ask teachers to think of the choices students might make in selecting a song to sing to demonstrate musical ability, or a specific track and field event to demonstrate athleticism. Assessment and rubrics are crucial here to ensure learning objectives are met. Finally, learning environment is a massive variable to consider. PBL looks very different in various classrooms, and it should, based on student need and readiness, as well as teacher style and readiness. Teachers will need to plan structures and procedures and communicate them consistently with students if PBL is to be successful. One thing to consider here is how asynchronous digital e-learning environments can be leveraged. So I hinted at this in the previous slide, but I want to emphasize it here. Essential elements to the instructional impact of high-quality PBL are assessment, feedback, and revision. Instead of assessment being viewed as assessment for or formative or assessment of summative learning, PBL often works as assessment as learning, where students are in the conversation with the teacher and peers about where they are, where they need to get, and how they are progressing as they work to get there. Learning strategies and procedures are put in place where what often starts as a management tool with students meeting milestones or benchmarks in order to progress toward the end goal become valuable learning moments where students self-evaluate their work and learning and do the same with their peers. They reflect and discuss, all the while with a teacher channeling this process toward an end goal. Because student voice and choice is often involved in this, students value the assessments, feedback, and reflection, as well as focus as much or more on the learning process as they do on the end result or the product. Teachers find that having a well-designed rubric that can be used as a guide or learning tool, and then ample opportunities for students to self-assess, peer assess, reflect, and ultimately revise throughout the learning process, student learning exponentially grows and their depth of knowledge and understanding increases. PBL relative to assessment is explored in much greater detail in another module. So an entry event and or entry document is kind of the door, as this image implies, or access point for students to engage with the problem or challenge the PBL unit is using to drive their learning. It launches the inquiry process and generates and sustains student energy. This element is explored in much greater detail in another learning module. Embedded best practices. So unfortunately, as the term project can dominate project-based learning with the risk of focusing too much on the creation of a product as opposed to focusing on the learning and the process, teachers can incorrectly assume they launch the inquiry, engage the students, put them in groups, give them a goal and a due date, and hopefully a rubric, and then just set them loose. But without quality classroom management instruction and checks to indicate progress, any unit, including a PBL unit, will be a disaster with little to no student learning. An effective PBL unit utilizes any of the instructional best practices we know work with students. It just frames them in a way that makes them student-centered and owned, as well as puts an inquiry perspective on the instruction. In Wayne Township, each day of instruction is rooted in the guaranteed and viable curriculum and utilizes lesson design, as well as any building level or district level initiative. We must work sometimes to differentiate in education between instructional strategies and instructional structures or perspectives, like differentiation, universal design for learning, understanding by design, technology integration. PBL acts like a filter or a lens we must put our curriculum, instruction, and assessment through. The tools you have success with in your classroom are essential, but they may be leveraged in a different way in the PBL context. Finally, the focus on rigor, and this is something we felt we needed to point out in Wayne Township. Educational authors like Mike Schmoker have criticized PBL, and even some of the research from experts like John Hattie show that problem-based learning has a minimal effect on student learning, while problem-solving does. Although Hattie points out that the data on PBL is skewed by an emphasis on standardized testing measures rather than on the other content and skills PBL emphasizes and develops. There are other studies that show PBL has a positive effect. BIE has a nice collection of these on their website if you want to look there. All of this is extremely important for us to consider as a cautionary tale. If any curricular or instructional initiative reduces rigor or is ineffective with students, please just don't use it. Recent reforms like Common Core, with its emphasis on the application and use of knowledge and the building of skills across disciplines, as well as the supplemental assessments created by PARCC and Smarter Balance, have strongly pushed education toward PBL instruction. Although Indiana has chosen to step out of the national conversation, it's important to note those reforms have not occurred in a vacuum. Technology and access to information have fundamentally changed the world we live in, and education is in the process of reactively making the shift. Employers and society are demanding employees that are motivated self-starters that can engage in self-directed inquiry, but also show proficiency in the 21st century soft skills to effectively problem solve, create, communicate, and collaborate in order to be productive. This is not changing regardless of legislature or the waves of initiatives on education. So this concludes our exercises in defining PBL and the overview of the essential elements here in Wayne Township. If you're following these modules in sequence, the next one is PBL and the degrees of inquiry, where you'll explore where PBL falls on the inquiry continuum. And these are just the citations for the images used in this presentation. Thank you.